The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood at his bedroom window, watching the world wake up beyond the gates. His hands gripped the windowsill tightly, knuckles white with tension. Today was different from any other day in his 39 years of life. Today he would have to say goodbye to someone who had been more than just a companion, someone who had been his anchor through the storm of royal duties. Catherine sat quietly on the edge of their bed, her usually perfect posture slightly slumped. She had been staring at the same spot on the carpet for nearly 20 minutes, lost in thoughts that seemed too heavy to share. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes between two people who understand each other completely. They both knew what this day meant, and neither wanted to be the first to acknowledge it out loud. The decision had been building for months. Palace officials had been increasingly concerned about public appearances and the changing dynamics of royal protocol. What had once been acceptable was now scrutinized under a microscope that seemed to magnify every gesture, every glance, every moment of genuine human connection. The press had become relentless, turning private moments into public spectacles and creating stories where none existed. William remembered the first time he had felt this connection. It wasn't the fairy tale beginning that people imagined. It had grown slowly, quietly, in the spaces between official engagements and formal dinners, in stolen moments during long car rides between ceremonies, in the comfortable silence of shared understanding when words weren't necessary. It had been built on respect, trust, and a recognition that they were both trapped in the same golden cage of royal expectations. Catherine had always understood the weight of duty. She had entered this world knowing that personal desires often came second to public obligations, but understanding something intellectually and living it emotionally were two very different things. She had spent years learning to navigate the complex rules of royal life, mastering the art of being present while remaining distant, of being warm while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The palace staff had noticed the change in atmosphere over the past few weeks. Conversations that once flowed easily had become stilted and formal. Laughter that had once echoed through the corridors had grown rare. Even the children seemed to sense that something was different, though they couldn't quite understand what was happening in the adult world around them. This morning was particularly difficult because it represented the end of something that had never been officially acknowledged to exist. There would be no public announcement, no formal statement to the press. The goodbye would happen in the same quiet way that everything meaningful in their lives had to happen, behind closed doors, away from the cameras, in the small spaces, where they were allowed to be human rather than symbols. William turned away from the window and looked at Catherine. She raised her eyes to meet his, and in that moment, they both understood that the time for avoiding the inevitable had come to an end. The palace had made its decision, and as always, personal feelings would have to yield to the greater good of the institution they served. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. In a world where they were constantly surrounded by people, staff, security, officials, photographers, they had found moments of genuine connection. And now, in the name of maintaining the very image that had brought them together, they would have to let that connection go. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm. Traffic moved through London streets, people hurried to work, children walked to school. None of them knew that inside the walls of Kensington Palace, two people were preparing to say goodbye to something that had given their carefully controlled lives meaning and warmth. The weight of unspoken words hung between them as they prepared for what would be their final private moment together. Soon the official day would begin, and they would once again become the public figures the world expected them to be. But for now, in these last quiet minutes, they were simply two people who had found something precious in an impossible situation and were about to lose it forever. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside brought them back to reality. Palace life ran on precise schedules, and their private secretary would soon arrive to discuss the day's agenda. Catherine stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress, with hands that trembled slightly. She had always been composed under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't about facing a difficult interview or managing a public appearance. This was about dismantling something that had become essential to her sense of self. William watched her move around the room, gathering the small personal items that had accumulated over the months, a book she had been reading, a photograph tucked discreetly behind others on the dresser, a handwritten note that had been passed quietly during a formal dinner. Each item told a story of moments stolen from the relentless schedule of royal obligations. The morning briefing would be particularly challenging today. They would have to sit in the same room, discuss upcoming engagements, review security arrangements, and coordinate their schedules, all while pretending that nothing fundamental had changed. The staff would be watching for any sign of discord, any hint that the perfect image they worked so hard to maintain might be cracking. Catherine had become expert at reading the subtle signs of palace politics. She knew when conversations stopped, as she entered a room, when glances were exchanged that carried more meaning than words, when decisions were being made about her life without her input. The institution of monarchy was bigger than any individual, and personal feelings were always secondary to public perception. The children had been asking questions, not direct ones. Royal children learned early that some topics were not discussed openly, but the kind of careful probing questions that showed they sensed something was changing. Their normally routine days had been disrupted by additional meetings, longer private conversations between adults, and a tension in the air that even young minds could detect. William's phone buzzed with the first of what would be dozens of messages today. Each notification was a reminder of the complex web of obligations, appearances, and expectations that governed every moment of their public lives. Somewhere in that endless stream of communications was the formal acknowledgement of what they both knew had to happen. The media had been circling for weeks, sensing a story but not quite able to grasp what it was. Royal correspondents had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect changes in the atmosphere around the palace. A canceled engagement here, a schedule change there, a different car arrangement for an official visit. All of these seemingly minor adjustments added up to a pattern that experienced journalists knew how to read. But this story would never be told in the way that others were. There would be no dramatic headlines, no tell-all interviews, no insider sources revealing palace secrets. This would be handled with the same discretion that surrounded all truly important matters in royal life. The public would never know what they were witnessing. They would see only the carefully managed image that would be presented to them. Catherine walked to the window where William had been standing earlier. The view was the same, but everything felt different now. The gardens below, which had once represented a kind of freedom within the constraints of palace life, now seemed like part of the prison walls that defined their existence. Every beautiful space, every comfortable room, every moment of apparent normalcy came with conditions and limitations that could change without warning. The knock on the door they had been expecting finally came. 3 gentle taps, the code that meant their private secretary was ready to begin the official day. William and Catherine looked at each other one last time as private individuals before opening the door to step back into their roles as public figures. Their eyes met briefly as William moved to answer the door. In that glance, they shared everything they couldn't say aloud. The gratitude for what they had found together, the sadness for what they were losing, the resignation to what duty demanded of them, and the unspoken promise that they would protect each other's dignity through whatever came next. The door opened, and the carefully orchestrated world of royal protocol swept them back into its embrace. From this moment forward, they would have to pretend that nothing had changed, that nothing had been lost, that they were exactly the same people they had always appeared to be to the outside world. The morning briefing took place in the oak-paneled study that had witnessed countless decisions affecting the royal family over the decades. William and Catherine sat in their usual chairs, maintaining the careful distance that protocol demanded, while their private secretary outlined the day's schedule with mechanical precision. Neither of them really heard the details about timing, security arrangements, or media protocols. They were both lost in their own thoughts about what this day would bring. The first public appearance was scheduled for 11 o'clock at a children's hospital in central London. It was the kind of engagement they had done hundreds of times before. Meeting with young patients, talking to medical staff, posing for photographs that would show the caring, human side of the royal family. Today, those same routine interactions would carry an additional weight that only they would understand. Catherine excused herself to get ready, leaving William alone with the secretary who continued droning through administrative details. The man had been with the palace for 15 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to ignore the emotional undercurrents that sometimes surfaced in royal life. His job was to manage schedules and logistics, not to acknowledge the human feelings that complicated the smooth operation of the monarchy. In her dressing room, Catherine stood before the mirror while her lady's maid helped with final preparations. The woman had been with her for years and knew her habits, her preferences, her moods. Today she worked in unusual silence, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening but knowing better than to ask questions that wouldn't be answered. The dress chosen for today's appearance was a soft blue, a color that photographed well and suggested both professionalism and warmth. Everything about royal appearances was calculated to send specific messages to different audiences. The choice of jewelry, the style of handbag, even the way hair was arranged all carried meaning in the complex visual language of monarchy. William was in his own preparation routine, but his mind kept drifting to moments from the past few months, the quiet conversations they had shared during long car rides to official engagements, the way Catherine had understood exactly what he meant with just a glance during tedious formal dinners, the rare moments when they had been able to laugh together about the absurdities of their highly regulated existence. The security team was conducting their final briefings in another part of the palace. They had noticed the increased tension in recent weeks, but approached it as a professional challenge rather than a human drama. Their job was to ensure physical safety and smooth logistics, not to interpret the emotional dynamics they observed but couldn't officially acknowledge. At 10:30, William and Catherine met in the main corridor for their departure. They stood, side by side, looking like the perfect royal couple that the public expected to see, but the space between them felt wider than the few inches protocol required. They had both become expert at hiding their true feelings, but today the mask felt heavier than usual. The drive to the hospital passed in near silence. Their protection officer sat in the front seat, occasionally speaking into his radio in the coded language that surrounded all royal movements. William and Catherine looked out opposite windows at the London streets, each lost in private thoughts about how to get through the next few hours with dignity and tact. The hospital staff had been preparing for weeks. Floors had been polished to perfection, flowers arranged in precise displays, and every person who would interact with the royal visitors had been briefed on proper protocol. The children's ward had been transformed into a showcase of the best that modern pediatric care could offer. As their car approached the hospital entrance, Catherine could see the familiar cluster of photographers and journalists waiting behind security barriers. These were people she recognized, royal correspondents who had covered her public life for years, cameramen who knew exactly which angles would produce the most flattering images, reporters who could write stories about royal visits in their sleep. But today felt different. She wondered if any of them sensed that they were about to witness something more significant than another routine charitable appearance. The experienced royal watchers had developed an almost mystical ability to detect when something important was happening, even when they couldn't quite identify what it was. William reached over and briefly touched her hand, a gesture so quick and subtle that even the protection officer in the front seat might have missed it. It was a moment of connection that violated no official protocols but carried enormous emotional weight. In that touch, he was telling her that whatever happened today, they would face it together with the same grace they had brought to every other challenge in their public lives. The car stopped, and within seconds, they were surrounded by the familiar choreography of a royal arrival. Doors opened in precise sequence, security personnel took their positions, and officials stepped forward to begin the carefully orchestrated welcome that would carry them through the next few hours. The moment they stepped out of the car, William and Catherine transformed into their public personas. Years of training kicked in automatically, the warm smiles, the confident posture, the gracious acknowledgement of the waiting crowd. But beneath the polished surface, they were both acutely aware that this performance carried additional significance today. The hospital director stepped forward with the rehearsed enthusiasm that marked all such occasions. He had been practicing his welcome remarks for days, ensuring that every word would be appropriate for the television cameras that were recording every moment. Behind him, a small group of senior medical staff waited in a carefully arranged line, each one briefed on what to say during their brief moment of royal attention. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Catherine found herself paying closer attention to details than usual. The artwork on the walls chosen to be cheerful but not distracting. The flowers that had been placed at strategic intervals to create a welcoming atmosphere. The way the lighting had been adjusted to ensure the most flattering photographs. Everything was perfect, just as it always was during royal visits. The children's ward had been transformed for their arrival. The young patients who were well enough to participate had been carefully selected and prepared for their encounter with royalty. Each child had been coached on what to say, how to behave, and what questions would be appropriate to ask. Even in a hospital setting, spontaneity was not allowed to interfere with the smooth execution of royal protocol. William knelt down to speak with a 7-year-old girl who was recovering from heart surgery. Her eyes lit up with genuine excitement that hadn't been rehearsed or manufactured for the cameras. In that moment, he remembered why these visits mattered, regardless of the personal cost. The joy on the child's face was real, and it reminded him that their public roles served purposes beyond the political machinery that surrounded them. Catherine moved through her own interactions with the professional warmth that had become second nature over the years. She asked the right questions, made the appropriate comments, and ensured that every person she met felt acknowledged and valued. But part of her mind was already moving ahead to the moment when this public performance would end, and they would have to face the private reality waiting for them. The photographers captured hundreds of images, William laughing with young patients, Catherine holding a baby, both of them listening intently to medical staff explaining new treatment techniques. These pictures would appear in newspapers and magazines around the world, reinforcing the image of a caring, engaged royal couple committed to public service. During a brief moment between official interactions, William and Catherine found themselves standing together near a window overlooking the hospital garden. For just a few seconds, they were able to drop their public masks and look at each other as they really were. Two people carrying the weight of impossible expectations while trying to maintain their humanity. The schedule moved forward with clockwork precision. They toured the new cardiac unit, met with families of young patients, and participated in a brief ceremony to officially open a renovated playroom. Every moment was timed to the minute, every interaction carefully managed to ensure maximum positive impact with minimum risk of complications. As they prepared for their final stop, a meeting with the hospital's board of directors, Catherine felt the weight of what was coming next. This would be their last official appearance together in this particular configuration. After today, everything would be different, though the outside world would never understand exactly what had changed. The board meeting was conducted in the hospital's conference room, with William and Catherine sitting at the head of a polished table surrounded by medical administrators and charitable fundraisers. They listened to presentations about future expansion plans, discussed strategies for improving pediatric care, and offered the kind of royal endorsement that could help secure funding for important medical research. But even as they fulfilled their official duties with the professionalism that had made them respected figures in charitable circles, they were both conscious of the ticking clock. Each completed agenda item brought them closer to the moment when they would have to return to the palace and face the personal consequences of the decisions that had been made about their lives. The final photographs were taken outside the hospital entrance with William and Catherine standing together against the backdrop of the building they had just visited. They looked like the perfect royal team, professional, caring, completely in sync with each other and their public mission. As they walked back to their waiting car, surrounded by the familiar bubble of security and protocol, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say about the public performance they had just completed, and too much to say about the private ordeal that was still ahead of them. The return journey to Kensington Palace felt longer than the morning drive, though the route was exactly the same. William and Catherine sat in their respective corners of the back seat, each staring out at the London streets that blurred past their tinted windows. The professional composure that had carried them through the hospital visit was beginning to crack. revealing the emotional strain they had been hiding all day. Their protection officer noticed the change in atmosphere but maintained his professional silence. He had been with the royal family long enough to understand that his job sometimes required him to pretend he couldn't see or hear things that were obviously happening right in front of him. Today was clearly one of those days when discretion was more important than acknowledgement. Catherine's phone buzzed with messages from palace staff, media coordinators, and charitable organizations responding to the morning's hospital visit. Each notification was a reminder of the complex web of relationships and obligations that surrounded every public appearance. The visit had been deemed a success. Positive media coverage, enthusiastic response from hospital staff, and touching interactions with young patients that reinforced the royal family's caring image. But success in royal terms was measured differently from success in human terms. The fact that they had managed to fulfill their public duties while dealing with private heartbreak would never be acknowledged or celebrated. It would simply be filed away as another example of the professional excellence that was expected from members of the royal family, under all circumstances. As they approached the palace gates, William could see the familiar cluster of photographers who maintained a constant vigil outside. These weren't the formal media representatives who had covered the morning's hospital visit. These were the paparazzi who made their living from capturing unguarded moments and unofficial interactions. Their telephoto lenses would be trained on the car windows, hoping to catch some expression or gesture that might hint at a story. The car passed through the security checkpoint and into the palace courtyard, temporarily shielding them from external observation. But inside the palace walls, they would face a different kind of scrutiny, the careful attention of staff members who had learned to read the subtle signs of royal moods and tensions. Catherine gathered her belongings slowly, reluctant to leave. The relative privacy of the car for the more public spaces of the palace. Even within their own home, they were rarely truly alone. Staff members moved constantly through the corridors, security personnel maintained their vigilant presence, and official visitors arrived throughout the day for meetings and briefings. The afternoon schedule included separate commitments that would keep them apart for several hours. William had meetings with representatives from his various charitable foundations, while Catherine was scheduled to review plans for upcoming international visits. Under normal circumstances, this separation would have been just another aspect of their busy professional lives. Today, it felt like a cruel preview of the larger separation that was coming. As they walked together toward the palace entrance, their steps unconsciously synchronized in the way that couples develop after years of shared experiences. They moved at the same pace, paused at the same moments, and navigated the familiar spaces with the easy coordination that had become second nature. The main entrance hall was bustling with the usual afternoon activity. Palace staff moved efficiently. Between meetings, security personnel monitored various access points and official visitors waited in designated areas for their scheduled appointments. In the midst of all this organized chaos, William and Catherine had to maintain their public personas even within their own home. They separated at the main staircase, William heading toward the administrative wing for his foundation meetings, Catherine climbing toward the private apartments to prepare for her own afternoon obligations. The simple act of walking in different directions felt loaded with significance, a physical representation of the emotional distance that would soon become permanent. Catherine's lady's maid was waiting in the private apartments with the afternoon's outfit already prepared. The woman had been with the royal household long enough to understand the rhythms of palace life, and she had noticed the subtle changes in routine and atmosphere over the past few weeks. But like everyone else in royal service, she had learned that personal observations were best kept to oneself. In his own preparation for the afternoon meetings, William found himself struggling to focus on the briefing materials his staff had prepared. The charitable foundations he supported were doing important work in areas he genuinely cared about. But today the reports and statistics felt like meaningless abstractions compared to the emotional reality he was facing. The palace functioned like a well-oiled machine with dozens of people working to ensure that every aspect of royal life proceeded smoothly. But machines don't account for human feelings, and the emotional turmoil that William and Catherine were experiencing was creating ripples throughout the carefully controlled environment. As the afternoon progressed, they would have to continue, performing their respective roles with the same dedication they had always shown. The foundations would receive their full attention, the international visit plans would be reviewed with appropriate thoroughness, and every public commitment would be honored with professional excellence. But underneath all of this surface competence, they were both counting down the hours until they would have to face the most difficult conversation of their lives together. Evening came with the subtle shift that marked the end of official palace business for the day. The last meetings had concluded, the final visitors had departed, and the corridors had grown quieter as staff members completed their duties and prepared to leave for their own homes. For William and Catherine, however, the most important moment of the day was still ahead. They met in the same private sitting room where they had begun the morning, but everything felt different now. The day's public performances had been completed successfully. The hospital visit had generated positive media coverage, the afternoon meetings had addressed important charitable business, and all their professional obligations had been fulfilled, with the excellence that was expected from them. Catherine sat in the chair by the window where the evening light cast long shadows across the room. She had changed into simple clothes, a gesture toward privacy in a life where even casual moments were often calculated for public consumption. William stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture that had become habitual during difficult conversations. The silence between them was different from the morning's quiet understanding. This was the silence of two people who knew they had to say goodbye but didn't know how to begin. All the words they had practiced in their minds throughout the day seemed inadequate for the enormity of what they were facing. When William finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. He talked about duty, about the responsibilities they both carried, about the decisions that had been made by people whose job it was to protect the institution they served. Catherine listened without interrupting, understanding that he needed to work through the official justifications before they could address the personal reality. She responded with equal care, acknowledging the logic of the arguments while making it clear that understanding something intellectually didn't make it hurt any less emotionally. They were both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, but they were determined to handle those circumstances with dignity and grace. The conversation moved slowly, carefully, with long pauses between exchanges. They talked about the children, about how to explain changes that couldn't be fully explained. They discussed practical arrangements and future interactions that would need to be managed with the same professionalism they brought to all their public duties. As darkness fell, outside the windows, they found themselves talking about moments they had shared, brief conversations during official events, glances exchanged across crowded rooms, the comfortable silences that had developed between them during long car rides to various engagements. These memories would have to sustain them through whatever came next. Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens that had been the backdrop for so many significant moments in royal history. Generations of royal family members had stood at these same windows, facing their own impossible choices between personal desires and public obligations. The weight of that history was both comforting and overwhelming. William joined her at the window, and for a moment they stood side by side looking out at the darkening gardens. In that shared silence, they found a kind of peace with their situation. They couldn't change the circumstances that had brought them to this point, but they could control how they responded to those circumstances. The goodbye, when it finally came, was quieter than either of them had expected. There were no dramatic declarations or emotional outbursts, just two people acknowledging that something precious was ending and expressing gratitude for what they had been able to share. They spoke about respect, about continuing to support each other in their public roles, and about maintaining the dignity that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. As Catherine prepared to leave the room, they shared one final look that contained all the things they couldn't say aloud. In her eyes, William saw understanding, forgiveness, and a strength that reminded him why he had been drawn to her in the first place. In his eyes, Catherine saw the same qualities that had made their connection so meaningful despite all the obstacles. The door closed softly behind her, leaving William alone in the sitting room with the evening shadows and the weight of what had just ended. Tomorrow they would both return to their public roles, appearing together at official events with the same professional warmth they had always displayed. The world would continue to see them as the perfect royal partnership, never knowing about the private goodbye that had taken place behind palace walls. In the months that followed, royal watchers would occasionally comment on subtle changes in dynamics or slight modifications in protocol, but the true story would remain hidden in the space between what the public could see and what actually happened in the private moments of royal life. Some goodbyes are too precious and too painful to be shared with the world, and this was one of them.